It is September 19th, 1777. A lot has happened with the Revolutionary War at this time. General Howe has left New York, traveled south by boat to attack Philadelphia from the Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, General Burgoyne has come back from England to Canada to round up a whole lot of men and his army to start a campaign to cut off the New England colonies of the United States. Meanwhile, in that time, General Washington has been trying to figure out just where he needs to send his army and try to make sure that Howe doesn't get him by surprise. And then General Schuyler, who was in the northern department of the army, he's in Albany for the most part, maintaining what needs to happen in the New York, New England area from the British. Schuyler is relieved after some incompetence and not being able to do what he needs as a general. So who to replace him but with General Horatio Gates? All in that time, we've had battles such as Brandywine happen on September 11th. We have had Fort Stanwix happen a month earlier. We've had the Battle of Bennington in what is now Vermont happen. And we have had as well Ticonderoga having been recaptured by the British. Now, that's not all necessarily in chronological order, but that is what has happened. Let's not forget the beginning of the year started with General Washington winning victories at Trenton twice and Princeton. So Horatio Gates has now taken control and lead of the Continental Army, and he has now Benedict Arnold, the traitor, with him to make sure they can fend off a large force of invading British army down Lake Champlain, with the goal, with I believe it's Saint Leger from Stanwix and the Mohawk, but that gets cut off and broken up. But to hold off General Burgoyne at this important spot today called Saratoga. And what is to come today on September 19th, 1777 is going to be the first Battle of Saratoga, mainly taking place at what is called Freeman's Farm. And that is where we are now. Now, mind you, I come to this battlefield during the government shutdown. So not everything is accessible, so I am walking and I'm hiking the trail with my books for reference in tow. I was hoping for the better, but sadly, I'm not able to drive. So I'm hiking, so I'm getting my exercise. That's the one good thing that comes with these battlefield walks. And being on top of the ridge overlooking at the visitor center, which is just above me right here, if you can see right here, overlooks this entire battlefield, at least around the Freeman farm area. And I must say, it is a beautiful battlefield. It is hard to fathom such bloodshed happened here. And that's what we're going to get to. So, this is the trail, Wilkinson's trail on the battlefield. And as you can tell, it's nice and peaceful and serene. But 248 years ago, not a little over a month, 248 years ago in a month, pretty much to the day, because today is the 7th, was the turning point of American history. It's quietly peaceful here. And where you see now are just the terrain. It's crazy terrain. I almost fell. That's fine, keeping it in. But no, this terrain is just crazy how this rolls. Just over this not little hill, but this hill is a visitor center right up there, as you can see. But this whole thing, just wow. Now remember, on a day like today, it's November 7th, it's like 41 degrees here. I can't remember what the weather was like on September 19th. I believe it was still pretty hot for both the Hessians with Riedesel, I believe that's how you actually properly pronounce his name, and British with Burgoyne, along with General Gates and traitorous Benedict Arnold. But it's a bit chilly out if you're not a fan of the cold. For me, I love the cold, so I'm wearing what my wife wants me to wear, so I don't get in trouble. But along here, so there's some readouts. But most of these are natural hills. So just walking a little bit of this terrain, geez, I can only imagine what these soldiers had to go through. Like right here, right on the hill is where I came through and came around. And then there's the visitor center right there for just to mark where we're at for reference point. So just walking along these trails and seeing this hallowed ground is just mind-boggling because of just how different this terrain is. Like, I've always been a person who loves to understand how battles were fought and where they were fought and the gruesomeness about it. But I can't take more than like 20 steps before the terrain changes up here. Like, holy heck. Like, I got my camera here. I want to take pictures, which I will as I do my pausing of the videos and whatnot. But holy heck, this terrain changes up so many times. It is just absolutely, like right behind me, like right there, there's a visitor center. You can hardly see it. But like, I'm hoping I can get enough like of this footage of just how much this terrain changes. And I have to also look at the map. I believe I'm about to go the right way to get to the Freeman's farm because the trail looks like it changes up a little bit here and I've come to that fork in the road. So let's go. So the first Battle of Saratoga took place on September 19th, 1777. And that took place nearby at a place called Freeman's Farm, where there was a light infantry redoubt built by the Continentals. Now, I'm walking this trail here, and it's a bit wet. I just gotta watch where I'm going because I don't want to slip and slide again. I almost did. But I can't stop thinking about this terrain now. See, I've been to Fredericksburg. We've been to Spotsylvania Courthouse. We've been to Chancellorsville. We've been to all these other battlefields. I've been to Monmouth, not on this channel. I've been to Monmouth. I've been to Harper's Ferry and Antietam. Like, I want to talk about difficult terrain. Holy heck. I'm just watching this. I can only imagine how hard it would be to stay in single file line, shoulder to shoulder, marching, charging, being fired upon. And I'm not even in shape. And that's the most ironic part. I'm in, I would say, okay shape because I'm able to walk these battlefields, but holy heck. I've always wanted to come to Saratoga. It's always been on my list. But I never thought how compact this battlefield is. Like, I knew it was compact, but I also didn't realize just how the terrain is. I mean, like, that tree. Look at the hill going up that tree. And then if I turn the camera around and try to get you to look down, that's like a little ravine, a little creek, a little stream. Just to put for reference, just how difficult it is to be. And I know I'm just rambling on, but you got to remember, these were young men, older men, all different types of classes fighting one another. There were loyalists at this battle too, so they were fighting their friends and family sometimes. So I would say it's a little upsetting for the most part. And I'm not walking the battlefield. I'm not necessarily familiar with trails. I can read a map, but I'm hoping I'm on the right trail to get to the Freeman's farm. Jeez, can you just see this terrain? And we're supposed to be over there. It's the visitor center. When I get to the top of this, I'll have to show here what I'm talking about. See, as I walk along here, coming up on top of this hill, I'm looking down into like these woods and this open terrain here, stuff like that. Here we are with this. Looks like I'm coming up on some cannons in the distance there. Well, this is the terrain. Now, to get back to the battle, or before it starts, because the first shot is going to be fired right here in Freeman Farm. I'm walking in, or I'm walking around where fighting actually happened. But I read that General Burgoyne, he was well loved among his men. They didn't care that he spent his time like an actual, general. They didn't care that he didn't camp with his men like how he normally would. They just had so much respect and love for him. And the same with Riedesel. Sorry, I learned from a gentleman when I got to the battlefield here how to properly pronounce Riedesel, who is a Hessian from Hessian. I believe that's how you properly call it. And almost tumbled there. Man, 2 times I've had it almost tumble. So now I gotta talk and walk at the same time and look at the ground. But no, Gates was loved, but Gates was having a bit of a feud with, I believe, Washington. But I think that's over and done with now by then. And then we have the traitorous Benedict Arnold, who just helped out Fort Stanwix from them being besieged on the Mohawk River. And Lafayette, down with Washington, recovering from his wounds and whatnot, he had a really great relationship with the Americans. But where we're at now is at the Freeman Farm Overlook. And holy heck, does this look like a feat for the armies. I'll show you. One might ask, what's the purpose of this campaign? And I would answer because waterways are the highways back in 18th, 17th, even early to late 19th century. If you control the waterways, you controlled your supply and demand. You control key aspects of terrain and for trade. And the Saratoga campaign is my favorite, one of my favorite campaigns. There's a lot of campaigns, but the Saratoga campaign is one of my favorite because it involves New York. You have Lake Champlain, just like the 7 Years' War. You had Lake Champlain. You had uh, Fort Ticonderoga, Fort William Henry at the south end of Lake George. The French knew the importance of Lake Champlain, hence why they built Fort Ticonderoga. Plus, it was a very close fort to the very northern tip of British rule in continental, on the continent. And then the British still also understood the importance of the Saratoga campaign, of Lake Champlain, and stuff like that. But it was supposed to have a force where Howe would come up through New York, which he didn't do because of communications and stuff like that, and it took forever to be able to communicate with somebody. But Howe was supposed to come up through New York and meet at Albany. He was supposed to meet Burgoyne here, not here, but he's supposed to be Burgoyne in Albany, and Saint Leger, I believe he's the, if I'm not mistaken, or Germain, one of the, I'll correct it here, but there's supposed to be another force coming down the St. Lawrence River, down the Mohawk River, and meet at Albany as well, because Albany is the capital. If you can, and the thing is, it's the Hudson, and for here, the Hudson River is, where am I facing? I believe maybe the Hudson River's east, so in this direction, the Hudson River. If you control the Hudson River, you can essentially cut off anything to the rest of the colonies. You can cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. It's kind of like Winfield Scott's plan for the the Anaconda Plan during the Civil War, and he's, the British, they want to be able to uh, cut off the head, because New England's more or less not necessarily controlling of the war, but if you can cut off one part, the rest will possibly follow off. That's the goal, and it's the same thing too with the Plattsburgh campaign. But we know how Plattsburgh ends up. But Burgoyne does have a naval force. He brings them as far south Lake Champlain as he can, stuff like that. And Schuyler, I can't pronounce his name properly. He's relieved. Gates takes over. Gates gets Benedict Arnold. They all, Howe goes south and fights to Philadelphia at Brandywine and takes over. And then you have Saint Leger gets knocked off at Fort Stanwix by the men there with Benedict Arnold and Gansevoort. I believe that's his name. Don't I will have to correct that if needed. And Benedict Arnold helps come save the day there too. But Benedict Arnold also comes back because he knows now of Burgoyne's plans with the Hessians is coming down here, and Gates ultimately meets him here at Saratoga. It is, I believe, 40 miles north of Albany, if I'm not mistaken, very close to the uh, capital of New York. Um, but I have books with me here to help go over now what happened on that September 19th day. So one of the books I have with me here today is the Battle Maps of the American Revolution by the American Battlefield Trust. This book is a great guide to summing up what actually took place at the battle here on September 19th, 1777. I'm going to read an excerpt from that page. Well, actually, I'm just going to read the whole page of that battle. Now, to the right there, that is the light infantry redoubt where that tree is. As you can see, it's just jutting out a little bit from my view. But the Battle of Saratoga, Freeman's Farm, which is what we're overlooking at right now, all along here. It says, in the fall of 1777, the wheels began to come off of John Burgoyne's northern campaign. Early victories at Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Anne, and Hubbardton gave way to defeat at Fort Stanwix and Bennington. The British strategy called for a three-pronged attack coordinated by three separate British armies converging on Albany, New York. The force moving from Lake Ontario and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger, so I was right, had besieged Fort Stanwix but could not crack its defense. A push up the Hudson River from General Sir Henry Clinton fizzled out due to Clinton's lack of aggression. Burgoyne's main force moving south from Canada came the closest to reaching its goal, but American resistance and supply problems plagued the 7,500-man force headed by Burgoyne himself. By mid-September, Burgoyne's army reached the northern outskirts of the small village of Saratoga. The Americans had problems of their own, namely dysfunction at their highest command levels. General Philip Schuyler commanded the Northern Department, but he was disliked by the New England militiamen, and a faction in Congress wanted to replace him. General Horatio Gates, a former British officer turned patriot, commanded in the Northern Department for a time before being replaced by Schuyler. And then Schuyler was once again replaced by Gates. This turnstile command structure hampered early efforts to slow Burgoyne, and it contributed to the loss of Fort Ticonderoga. On August 4th, 1777, Gates assumed command of the Northern Department. He was supported by two capable subordinates, General Benedict Arnold and Colonel Daniel Morgan, leader of a storied Virginia Rifle Regiment. Gates' army numbered some 8,500 men. To disrupt the British advance south, the American commander ordered his men to erect defenses on the crest of Bemis Heights, which is part of a series of bluffs from which both the Hudson River and the paralleling road could be seen. From there, American artillery had the range to hit both the river and the road. In order to attack, the British would have to use the road because the forest and vegetation to the east were too dense to permit effective troop movements. The Americans erected fortifications that extended about 3/4 of a mile, creating a line shaped like a large L. 22 cannons were in place along the line, providing the Americans with ample artillery cover. On September 19, 1777, Burgoyne divided his army into 3 columns. He wanted to use each column to probe American defenses. Morgan's Virginians engaged with the center column on September 19th near the farm of the loyalist John Freeman. It was a hotly contested fight. Gates reinforced Morgan, and a seesaw action occurred throughout the afternoon. Patriots captured British cannon, only to have them retaken by the enemy. Morgan and Arnold led counterattacks as American riflemen wreaked havoc on the Tory officer corps. By evening, the British held the field, but the action had blunted their forward motion. Hoping to be reinforced by Clinton from New York City, Burgoyne chose to dig in and wait out the Americans until help arrived. Help arrived, but for the rebels rather than the British. And as we see here, on this book, on the page of the book. As we see there, the farm is right here, right in front of us. And there they had the 3rd New Hampshire, 2nd New Hampshire, 1st New Hampshire, the Morgan Rifles all in line. And behind them were the Morgan Rifles again, Dearborn the Light Infantry Regiment. And against them would be the 21st Regiment, the 62nd Regiment, the 20th Regiment, Haddon's guns, Jones's guns, and a whole bunch just taken off, all led by Poor and Morgan. And eventually Benedict Arnold will come up and help save the day by having a little bit of guts. So that's what we get from the American Battlefield Trust Map. So here I have another book, A Battlefield Atlas of the American Revolution by Craig L. Symonds. And on the page here, on page 47, it says, Gates' position was a strong one. This wind is attacking me very ferociously. I lost my hat several times, but must go on. So Gates' position was a strong one. His army occupied a high bluff overlooking the Hudson River near Bemis's Tavern, where the Polish engineer Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko had laid out strong entrenchments. On the right, Gates placed the brigades of Glover, Nixon, and Patterson, about 3,000 men, and the bulk of his artillery. And a little to the west, near a farmhouse belonging to a Mr. Nielsen, Gates placed his center under Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned and established his own headquarters. On his western or left flank, Gates placed Benedict Arnold with several New England regiments and the riflemen of Daniel Morgan. It was a strong position, but not unassailable. If the British could get around Arnold's flank, they could seize higher ground to the west and use their artillery to force the Americans out of their fortifications, as they had at Fort Ticonderoga. For that reason, Arnold urged Gates to assail Burgoyne during his approach, but Gates rejected Arnold's advice and awaited a British attack. During his confrontation with Gates' army, Burgoyne was literally groping in the dark. The area was so thickly wooded and the terrain so uneven. Yeah, we walked a good amount of it right now, and that was just over to my west, I believe. Burgoyne had no clear picture of the American positions. Nevertheless, at 10 a.m. on September 19th, Burgoyne began a tentative advance, sending his men forward in 3 divisions through the thick forest of mixed pine and hardwoods. Arnold begged Gates for permission to strike them, and finally Gates agreed to send Morgan's riflemen forward and told Arnold that he could involve the rest of his command if the situation justified it. Arnold, around midday, the center corps of Brigadier General John Hamilton, accompanied by Burgoyne himself, came under fire from the woods around the clearing at Freeman's farm. Concentrating on the officers and the gunners, Morgan's men picked off the redcoats one by one until the frustrated British mounted a charge. Arnold brought his regiments forward and a general engagement ensued. The British forces were soon in serious trouble, and Arnold sent word back to Gates that with a few reinforcements he could defeat the British altogether. But Gates not only refused to budge, he ordered Arnold back to the American lines, orders which Arnold ignored. For the British, the situation was saved by Riedesel, who marched his men toward the sound of the guns and managed to drive off Arnold's impetuous attacks. Riedesel's initiative prevented what might have turned into a full-scale disaster for the British. Even as it was, though the British held the field at nightfall, they had suffered terrible casualties. Some 600 British, many of them officers, had fallen to the American marksmen, while the Americans had suffered fewer than 300 casualties. In addition, the fighting spirit of many of Burgoyne's veterans had been shaken by the character of the Wilderness battle. Moreover, they knew that Gates' army still lay across their intended line of advance. Gosh, I can only imagine what it would be like fighting here in the woods, in a territory or in an area where you're not familiar with, and you're getting picked off by these rebels, these hunters that earn such a really good reputation for that. As I said, I can just imagine the fear they would have to go through being targets, and it doesn't help that the way the British dressed themselves for battle, that the officers were quite distinguishedly noticeable compared to the foot soldiers. And that's what helped Daniel Morgan and his men essentially snipe the and pick off the British officers, leading to such a defeat. Even though it was a victory for the British, they still lost because of the casualties. They held the ground, they held the field, but at the end of the day, they were licking their wounds. Now, I have here The Battle of Saratoga by Rupert Furneux, and it's the book I'm currently reading, but I'm jumping ahead because at Freeman's farm, it says here by General Glover on page 182. I'll let it go. Both armies seemed determined to conquer or die. One continual blaze without any intermission till dark, when by consent of both parties it ceased, during which time we several times drove them, took the ground, passing over great numbers of their dead and wounded. Took one field prize, but the woods and brush were so thick, that being close pushed by another party of the enemy coming up, was obliged to give up our prize. The enemy in turn sometimes drove us. They were bold, intrepid, and fought like heroes. And I do assure you, sirs, our men were equally bold and courageous, and fought like men fighting for their all. Here on 183, it said, even without Arnold's guiding hand, the British center column was in danger of being annihilated. Von Riedesel tells the story of his intervention. He had heard the firing since 1 p.m., and in consequence he had collected his men to be ready for any eventuality. Towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Major Bloomfield of the artillery returned. He had accompanied Phillips on his reconnoitering expedition, and had now been sent back by him to Riedesel with the report that the Brunswick light troops belonging to the advance guard of the right wing were already hotly engaged with the enemy, that the latter were drawn up in order of battle, and that a general engagement would take place that very afternoon. Major Bloomfield was accordingly directed to bring back with him a few heavy guns from the artillery train for the support of the right wing, but scarcely had he left when the fire of musketry began anew. Riedesel, having as yet heard nothing from Burgoyne, immediately dispatched Captain Willow to the latter, at the same time posting his men so that he could not be taken by surprise. It was one of the utmost importance that the ground between bridges numbers 1 and 2 should be held, as upon that depended the salvation of the entire army. Here were the artillery and supply train. In fact, here near Taylor's house, situated about 3.5 miles south of Fish Creek, and about 100 rods north of the road that led from the meadows on to the plateau, was the main position. This point was occupied by the regiment Riedesel, which had for its support 2 6-pounders under Captain Pausch, posted in an advantageous position, a little in advance, some Indians running across the woods and mountains from the right wing reported that a few regiments of the enemy had marched to within a short distance of the left wing. This story, moreover, was the more credible, as some rebel patrols who had been seen on the plain had shot the horse of a dragoon while acting as sentry. In the meantime, the firing lasted until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Captain Willow returned with a message from Burgoyne to the effect that Riedesel, after reinforcing his rest of the troops, and attacked the flank of the enemy near Freeman's farm. Riedesel accordingly immediately selected for this purpose 2 companies from Regiment Retz and the whole of his own regiment, together with 2 cannons, their places being filled by the remaining 3 companies of the Regiment Retz, leaving Brigadier Spett with the 47th and the heavy artillery in command on the river. Riedesel took the road behind bridge number 2 and crossed the new one, number 3, leading to the plain. Here he stationed guard. After crossing the bridge, he hastened, with 2 companies of the regiment Retz, as an advance guard, as quickly as possible on a road 1½ English miles long through the woods till he arrived on an eminence, from the top of which he could see the engagement of the right wing. The enemy were posted on a corner of the woods, having on his right flank for defense a deep muddy ditch, the bank of which had been rendered inaccessible by stones, underbrush, and barricades. In front of this corner of the forest, entirely surrounded by dense woods, was a vacant space, on which the English regiments were drawn up in line. The struggle was for the possession of this vacant space, on which, by the way, Freeman's farm was situated. It had already been in possession of both parties, and now served as a support for the left flank of the English right wing, and the right flank being covered by the corps of Fraser and Bremen. The 9th served as a reserve. While General Riedesel arrived on the eminence, the battle was raging the fiercest. The Americans, far superior in numbers, had for the 6th time hurled fresh troops against the 3 English regiments, the 20th, the 21st, and the 62nd. The guns on this wing were already silenced, there being no more ammunition, and all the artillerymen having either been killed or wounded. The 3 brave English regiments had been, by the steady fire of fresh relays of the enemy, thinned down to 1/2, and now formed a small band surrounded by heaps of dead and wounded. This was the scene presented of the view Riedesel on his arrival of the height. Every moment he expected to see the little band either captured or annihilated by Americans. Quickly and without waiting for the rest of his troops, with drums beating and his men shouting, "Hurrah!" he attacked the enemy on the double quick. Posting his troops at the edge of the above-mentioned ditch, he sent such a well-directed volley among the Americans that those troops who were coming out of the woods and about to fall upon the English were startled and turned back. The British, animated with fresh courage, pressed forward at the point of the bayonet. Meanwhile, Captain Pausch arrived with his guns at the right moment, and forming into line with the English, opened fire with grape shot. The regiment Riedesel also arrived in the nick of time, and joining the 2 companies on the ditch, considerably extended the line of fire. I have with me here this one last book, 1777, Tipping Point at Saratoga by Dean Snell. And I want to read a passage here at 5 p.m. on page 126. It says, 5 p.m., Stephen Harvey, the British column at Freeman's Farm. Lieutenant Stephen Harvey of the 62nd Regiment was not far away from Haddon's guns. He was young for his rank, but well connected through his uncle, an adjutant general with the same name. The younger Harvey was wounded early in the afternoon, but this was his first real action, and he was not about to let a scratch force him from the field. Then he was wounded again, and later, still again. The American riflemen in the trees on the far side of the field seemed to be taking a special interest in him. He was hit several times as the battle reached its peak, and nearly each time he was struck, he was ordered by Lieutenant Colonel Anstruther to go to the rear. He ignored each one until a ball smashed in one of his legs. It was a crippling wound. This time it was clear that he had to be moved to the rear. As he was being helped from the field, yet another ball struck him in the midsection, tearing through his gut. Such wounds were invariably fatal. Anstruther watched the young lieutenant be carried away, but the colonel stayed on the field and was soon wounded himself. So were Major Henry Harnage and Ensign Henry Young. They were the 4 of the 11 officers from the 62nd killed or wounded in the course of the afternoon. The 62nd was no longer an effective regiment. By now, over 160 officers and men, more than half the regiment, were dead, wounded, or captured, and what was left of the 62nd fell back, leaving Haddon's guns once again in American hands. The Americans seemed to be bringing up new regiments at will. Time and time again, the British line charged. Time and again, it had fallen back again before yet another countercharge by fresh American troops. And at 5:15 p.m., General Phillips was relieved when he saw Major Griffith Williams approaching behind the 20th with two additional 6-pounders from the artillery park and fresh artillerymen to man them. The guns, Williams' Thunderers, were brought forward, propelled by Williams' constant loud groans and curses. The British center column was hard pressed by superior American numbers, and his men were close to breaking. Phillips broke away from Burgoyne and rode through heavy fire to help bring the additional pieces of artillery up to support the 20th Regiment. The British line stabilized for the moment. When Riedesel emerged from Freeman's farm fields, he saw both armies fully engaged. The German troops were close to the right flank of the Americans, and the English left flank in front of it was on the point of retreating. The two companies from the regiment von Retz arrived first and began firing on the American flank. The regiment von Riedesel came up from behind and began firing by platoon. The soldiers of the 20th saw this and took heart. The attack rallied the beleaguered 20th one more time. Haddon's guns were retaken one last time. When Captain George Pausch emerged from the woods with his Hessian artillery brigade, he saw that Riedesel had stopped the American advance. Pausch wheeled his two 6-pounders into the line and began sending murderous quantities of canister into the American flank, as rapidly as his crews could fire. It was too much even for fresh American troops. The Americans fell back. To conclude the battle, 10 p.m., Richard Varick, the American camp at Bemis Heights. It had been a long day, but Richard Varick was still energized by the action. He had sat down to write another long letter to General Philip Schuyler in Albany, having detained the latest express rider in order to have it delivered quickly. He lamented that Lincoln had still not arrived, but he was sure that Burgoyne's army had been rapidly crippled by the fighting. He laid out the sequence of battle as best he could from what he had been able to see himself or learn from others in the evening. He was close enough now to the American hospital in the barn to be haunted by the groans and the cries of the wounded there. He could not sleep. He begged Schuyler to send more wagons to take the wounded to Albany for treatment, and while he was at it, to first make sure the same wagons carried rum to camp for the men. He had heard Gates' orders that all tents would be struck and wagons loaded by 3 the next morning, and was sure it meant that they would be renewing the battle at first light. What else could it mean? Surely they would have Burgoyne on the run by noon Saturday, and the Northern Army would be on its way to Saratoga. At 11, another express rider arrived with a letter from Schuyler. So Varick resumed writing. Washington was having success off to the south, according to Schuyler. Varick was pleased to read this, but he was soon grumbling again about Lincoln's protracted and probably fruitless airy scheme to capture British positions at Lake George and Ticonderoga. He decided to keep one of the express riders with him until Sunday evening, in case there was additional good news to send back to Albany at that time. Meanwhile, British prisoners told Gates that Burgoyne might launch a desperate attack in the morning. Supplies of shot and powder were nearly exhausted for several American regiments, and half of Gates' army clearly needed more than a few hours' rest. The tents would be struck and the wagons loaded well before dawn, but the immediate goal was not to strike for Saratoga. No, the immediate goal was to save the army from disaster by pulling back south of the Mohawk River if necessary. The day had ended in a stalemate. Parts of both armies were exhausted, some regiments badly bloodied. The Americans had returned to their lines. The British and German troops made camp more or less on the ground they held at the end of the day. Burgoyne worried as Gates did. His regiments were camped in open ground and thus vulnerable to an attack. His British and German troops needed time to dig in. Both commanders had regiments that were still fresh and ready to continue the action. Both expected help to arrive soon, but both also had good reasons to pause and regroup. In fact, the hope for arrival of help would lead both Gates and Burgoyne to delay. While Washington struggled to avoid defeat in fighting around Philadelphia, the commanders of north of Albany settled into a protracted middle game that would lead to a decisive final battle in the northern theater of the war. Now, as you can tell, my hair is quite blown about, but as I walk back to the car to head out, I wanted to take a moment to just think about how brutal this battle was. You know, I say it all the time, you know, battles and war is ugly. The men who fight these wars, they, although they live, they get to live with what happened. That's suffering after the war. That's where we have cases of the PTSD and all the other stuff. That it's first called shell shock and it's called this and that. What ultimately is it comes to, it's just tragedy. It's nothing but war is tragic. War is not fun. Almost every battle that ever happens, regardless of who's on what side, they always rue and not want to fight the next day or the next battle. They want to go home. That's why there's desertions too. You know, Saratoga was not, you know, it wasn't immune to that. Even the first day's battle on September 19th, 1777. I can only imagine what was going through those minds of those men. The Americans, the British, the Hessians. They're professional soldiers, but at the end of the day, they're still human. They still have families. They still have lives. And they lay them down for either the sake of their country, freedom, or if it's just a job to make money for their family too. Because the Hessians, they were hired by the British, by their, I would say, like, ruler or their, whatever you like to call them, the ruler of their sect or something like that. And the British, although saw this as a rebellion, because it was, they had families too, every man. And the patriots, they were fighting for their families. They were fighting for, so they had the most to lose. And who was all but looking during the Battle of Saratoga in the Revolutionary War? The rest of the world. The American Revolution is something that changed history, and it was fought by these brave men. Any war is fought by brave men, regardless of the side you're fighting on. Because to go into battle and to just see utter bloodshed and chaos and carnage, not necessarily built into our, our thought, our mind. It's not built into our DNA to love war. It's not built into our DNA to fight and see another man dying. I go to these battlefields to help remember those men, to help keep the American spirit alive as well, to help preserve their memories, and to help try to interpret what it could have been like. Battle of Saratoga is one of them. Battles, actually, to be more correct. And for that, the turning point of the war has now begun. The first Battle of Saratoga is complete with a stalemate, as you'd say. It's like Monmouth before it, actually Monmouth after it, you could say. First stalemate, but at the same time, one that will lead to absolute victory for the Americans. The first ever for the British Army will have happened. But that will be for another video. And then in the meantime, as I walk this battlefield and not fall over, because that would be horrible. I'm not under fire, and I still slip and fall. That would suck. But with that, I will end the video here. If you did like this video, and if you like what you see, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.